Hello and welcome to this week's Draw, Print and Paint video. The exercise this week is a nice, simple one. All I want you to do is each day come up with one drawing. I don't want you to spend any more than maybe 10, 15 minutes time. It can be a drawing, and when I say drawing, it can be a drawing, with ink, or I'm happy to extend it to some watercolour as well. But what I want you to do is capture a skyscape every day. Just one, every day. I mean, if you do more, some of you may do more, but at least one for 7 days consecutively. Each one can be the same time of day, but you may like to capture some other times of day as well. But quite simply, it's that you get into the habit of doing it, and that you do it as quickly as possible. Some of you, I have posted some of these on Instagram before and shown you in other videos some of these very quick skyscapes that I've done in a sketchbook. It doesn't have to be in anything spectacular in terms of the best quality paper or anything like that. As you know, sometimes the best quality papers can come up with some fantastic results. But be thinking of a format. So here you can see in my sketchbook I've used that long skinny marine format to do these ones. The only other element that I would like to see you do is that within that skyscape include a foreground mass that gives them some context. So it might be just a dark tree line, or just a simple impression of a shape that is the foreground, that it gives you some context that you can remember maybe where it was from that you were looking. The other aspect of this week's exercise is that I don't want you to be taking a photograph and doing it back inside in the studio. There's two methods that I want you to be using. Either doing it on plein air, so outside, doing it there with the motive in front of you, or from memory, that you might see a sky and then record it. And that's where that speed element comes in that I mentioned before. I don't want you to be spending hours and hours on each one of these. No more than 10 to 15 minutes. They're to be quick little sketches of skies. Pretty easy. Let's go through a few different methods that you might do in your approach to this. If you're going to do this exercise with some watercolour, I would say don't really worry about whether you're working on watercolour paper or not. Here are just some watercolour sketches in my sketchbook. The paper in here is a little bit like blotting paper in that it soaks up the colour very, very quickly. Some other sketchbooks behave quite differently. They don't necessarily, they do start to behave a bit more like watercolour paper, that they don't soak up the paint quite as quickly or as rapidly. And be using them to whatever advantage you can. So for instance, this one here is very much just like blotting paper. You can see, when you put a mark down, you really can't move it around, or the paint just soaks straight into the paper. But that can be really, really useful if you're working with a far drier brush, or with a more dry brush techniques, thinking about those marks that we were making when we were dotting and dabbing and things. And if you think about really using here this part of the brush, so in this case you can see here I can make some really interesting rough marks, and what I'm doing is pressing here with the brush, and you can see the tips of the bristles are not up, so I'm pushing here with the end of the ferrule in and letting sort of whatever happens with the bristles happen, and we're getting these kind of really lovely marks. And so they can be really useful. So I'm keeping the paint sort of fairly dry, almost painting directly out of the pans here. And so thinking about using the brush, and that those fanny bits of the brush are pointing in to clouds so that you get those rough shapes happening. Oops, starting to get too dry. And you can be building up by placing one mark over the top. So if you do start with this, you can be thinking about placing a series of, that's probably a little bit too dark, out of control here today, some lighter marks so that the watercolour is lighter in tone. And then start to work over the top with a darker, stronger wash. Of watercolour like that. I'll just start to move this on a little bit. It's starting to get a little bit tight, as Constable would say. And then move on adding in those darker passages. So as I said here, I'm using the paper to my advantage rather than trying to work against it. And the fact that the colour doesn't move is useful in this example. What I want you to do when you're doing this exercise is be conscious about the effects depending on the order that you do things. So for instance, if I'll do this over 2 sheets, if I wet the sheet just very lightly, just so that it's got a bit of ability for the water to move around. And do, and I'm going to do a 3 mix of colour. So I'm going to start with the cobalt blue, adding a little bit of a earthy red in, which I think this one's Indian red this time. And I think this is Indian yellow, just to give it, now you can see it's sort of gone a greeny grey. There's a little bit of yellowness in it, which is really quite suitable for the clouds that I'm looking at out here out my studio window today. Just going to make that a little stronger. Ooh, too red. We need to add a bit more of that. A bit more of that. That's it. A little bit greeny and a little bit stronger. So we've wet that, and if we put down, so at the moment when I'm looking at the window today, I'm sort of looking into the clouds from the sun behind them, so that's why they've got that sort of greeny greyness to them. So they're very much these large dark blobs silhouetted with the white edge of the cloud and then the blue beyond. So I'm looking and I'm seeing these, and that's where I'm going to just go for the dark blobs that I can see. The other thing too I'd suggest is don't over mix. See how here the colour has started to separate in the palette, and rather than keeping on going into it and working it up so that it separates again, every time that I refill and need to refill my brush, I will just dip into it so that I'm picking up the separated colour. And so what happens then here on the page is some interesting things. The granulation and the separation is already starting to happen, if that's what you're after, of course. And sometimes for skies, that's really quite lovely. And you can make this as quick or as long. I mean, I'm being a bit probably fastidious here and mucking around a little bit too much. And you can see the paper is starting to dry because of the sun too. So these areas are really starting to run, whereas those areas haven't. And I'll just wait a little bit to let that paper really start to dry up before I go in with the blue, and keeping the blue a little, I'm just going to touch it with a little bit of that and a little bit of the yellow. Wow, too much. Just to get a bit of a steely blue look to it, rather than just blue. It's quite nice. And by now the paper has really started to dry, so unlike these first passages that I've put down, which have had time to spread because of the wet paper, these areas aren't maybe necessarily going to spread as much. So the edges of what I'm putting down here now as blue are crisper. Crispish. So there you can see there's a slight difference in the way that they've spread. Now if we go the other way, you can do it either way. And we can go back the other way. Of this time, thinking about our blue passages and letting the edges of those really blend. And mix. And thus sit there and let that dry for a moment or two. Before coming back in now with our dark. Add a little bit of cobalt blue into that mix that I was using before. It's probably still a bit too wet. But I think you get a little bit of the idea that depending on where the paper, how dry the paper is, you'll get crisper or softer edges to those passages that you put down. You can probably really see it in that one there. The paper was drying quite quickly on that one. And so you're starting to get these lovely crisp edges to the blues, whereas the darks are a little bit more softer around those edges. And to work either way, it doesn't matter. Now, if you don't want to be doing these studies with watercolour, you can also be doing these with pencil or even just black ink too. And in terms of how you approach that is again still just keeping it simple and thinking about the contrasts that you can see. So in terms of a sky, is that you might be considering some of those darker shapes of the dark parts of the clouds. And coming up with simple sketches like that. Or even developing them even further to describe then maybe with a darker tone, or go the other way too. You could be doing this as the dark of the cloud, and then just by pressing the pencil more, getting that darker tone, and just observing those shapes to get some cloud shapes happening with, as I said, you know, just simple, keep it silhouette the foreground. So just simple little shapes like that. Sorry, I just have to do this one better because that's better. For instance, like that. Now, as I said too, you could be also doing this. So that's more massed and tonal, but of course, if I just draw a line there so you can see that there's another one here underneath, is that, you know, it could be just almost like a modelled gesture of feeling around those hard and soft edges of what you're looking at. So, like I said, you could also be doing something that is black and white or one colour and white, like with ink. So this is just like a sepia ink that I've got. And again, just thinking about those major contrasts that you can see in the sky. And then often by introducing a simple architectural or something element like that in silhouette, gives a context to those marks that you're making. Like so. So, like I said at the beginning, the exercise for you this week is keeping it very simple. Don't go into any great detail. The challenge is to getting into the habit of doing this each day. So just a simple sky study, whether it be a watercolour in whatever fashion you want to do it, or back even just, as I said, simple black and white sketches with a pencil. Maybe just try and keep it to a single pencil like I did, which was an 8B, or even just with some ink. The other part of that challenge, of course, too, is not to be taking a photograph and working from a photograph. It's for you to either be working from memory and putting it down, or by actually looking. And try and record maybe some different times of day. Don't try and necessarily do them all as sunsets or sunrises. Try and maybe get some of what's going on in the middle of the day, as well as in mid-afternoon or mid-morning, and build up this record of different skies over a week. Good luck, and I look forward, as always, to seeing what you get up to.